It's the beginning of a big week for the U.S. economy. Let's check our economic report card now. First, GDP. That report out Friday. The White House claims 3.2% annual growth is sustainable. On Tuesday and Wednesday, the Federal Reserve will meet as questions continue to swirl around the Fed's independence. And on Friday, the monthly jobs report will give us a snapshot of the labour market. OK, so let's get some context. Joining us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Kenneth Rogoff. He's Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University and the former Chief Economist of the IMF. Professor Rogoff, fantastic to have you on the show. Some looked at that headline GDP print and said, look, actually, the consumer was muted, investment was down, inventory was high, inflation was muted. What makes you so much more positive about the US economy and growth in particular right now, particularly versus some of the other commentators out there?
Well, I think a lot of people just say growth is low in the population, growth is low in population. You just can't have 3% growth. But I would say we still have a lot of makeup from the 10 weak years after the financial crisis. So regardless of President Trump's policies, I've thought the U.S. would do better. This number is probably higher than the U.S. is really doing. But let's not forget, a month ago, everybody was talking about we were about to enter a recession. And I think this really dashed that idea.
So does that push out the prospect of future recession for how long? What are you thinking in terms of tracking growth this year, and how long before we do have to necessarily worry about a U.S. recession?
Well, it's not imminent. It's just always possible that something happens, like a crisis in China, a rise in global interest rates. In any given year, there's probably a 15 or 20% chance of a mild recession. But I think the chances of a really big recession sometime soon are really, getting to be long, not likely. The Fed looks like it's not going to have to hike rates for a while. Inflation's very muted. And to your point about the consumer, there was very good data on consumers today. So the U.S. picture looks good. Europe looks a little better. China looks better. But I think the U.S. Really is the shining light in the global economy right now.
As you said, the Fed doesn't look like it has to hike rates. What about cutting them then, in light of what we've seen in terms of the inflation picture here? Is there going to be space, particularly with the strong dollar here, that actually they could ease rates and give further support?
They could, and of course, President Trump's been pushing them to do that, but I don't think it would be very smart. Unemployment, I don't know, like at a 50-year low, and maybe the famed Phillips curve, the trade-off between unemployment, growth, and inflation, maybe it's dead, maybe it's not. I think the Fed's just going to sit tight and say we're excited about the numbers, but our forecast for the year, still have inflation low. We're going to wait and see.
To just sit on hands for now and stick with the patient policy. What about China? Because you pointed this out here. How surprised are you by the tone that we got from President Xi in that One Belt Forum, where he was saying, look, we're ready to tackle intellectual property theft and technology transfers? It seemed like they were ready to do a trade deal here and give up some ill-gotten gains.
It was really surprising that he was so forthright about that. I mean, let's understand, we don't know if they'll actually do any of it. But the Chinese had insisted that we will not do this under pressure. We will, do structural reforms. We will open up our economy as we see fit. If you force us to do it, we'll hide in our shell like a turtle. So it was pretty surprising. I mean, I would say China blinked. They said they weren't going to respond to these demands. They did. Not all of the demands are really a good idea. That President Trump seems to be trying to tell them to keep their exchange rate stable. China's a big country. They have very different business cycles than the U.S. That's like a really bad idea. But for now, they said they'd do that, too.
Do you think Chinese growth surprises us? Chinese data surprises us this year and actually provides global economic support?
Yeah, well, there's no question that especially some of what Europe was feeling was that Chinese growth was low. I think auto imports in China fell by 50% in December. Things have picked up. But I think you have to understand China's coming to the end of the road on its big growth period. They're already been falling. They're now talking about only 6%. I think their growth over the next 10 years might just be 3 or 4%. They're overbuilt in housing. China still has a very rocky road ahead, having a soft landing onto a downhill slope with their economy.
You spoke at the IMF in the last week or so, saying that we're facing the beginning of the end for central bank independence. What's your remedy here for wrestling back control when rates are so low, inflation isn't a problem, they're kind of running out of jobs to do and should leave it to the finance ministers, perhaps?
Well, I think they should leave to the finance ministers maturity management, how much debt is shorted, how much is long, and without getting into a lot of rigmarole, that's what they've been doing. I think the future of central banking, if interest rates stay this low, is creating more space to have negative interest rates in a recession, not just out of the blue. Because if they don't, they just don't have an independent policy. Now, there are many countries where central bank independence is under pressure. And I suspect in those countries, if they go ahead and reabsorb the central bank, they bully the central bank, they'll eventually get much higher inflation. I think central bank independence, the idea is not dead. It's as important as ever, but I do think we'll see it tested over the next year or two.